Something strange has been happening in modern dating over the past few years. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. More and more men are simply stepping away from the entire dating world. They're deleting the apps, they're avoiding relationships, some aren't even trying anymore. And what's interesting is that most of them aren't angry. They're not protesting, they're not blaming anyone, they're just done. But the real question is this: why are so many men quietly walking away from dating? At first glance, it doesn't seem to make sense. After all, we live in a time where meeting people has never been easier. Dating apps promise endless options. Social media connects millions of people instantly. Technology has made introductions faster, easier, and more accessible than at any other point in human history. In theory, this should be the golden age of dating. But if you talk to many men today, the story you hear sounds very different. Instead of excitement, you hear exhaustion. Instead of optimism, you hear quiet resignation. And instead of actively searching for relationships, many men are slowly choosing something else: distance. Not because they never wanted connection, but because somewhere along the way, the experience itself started to feel different, less meaningful, less human. And for many men, something about modern dating stopped making sense. But this shift didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. At first, it looked like small changes, more conversations that went nowhere, more matches that never turned into real meetings, more situations where effort seemed to lead nowhere. And eventually, something subtle began to happen. Many men simply stopped trying as hard, not out of bitterness, but out of fatigue. And once you start noticing this pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. Men who once actively pursued relationships now say things like, "I'm just focusing on myself right now. I'm taking a break from dating. It's just not worth the energy anymore." And interestingly, many of these men aren't socially isolated. They have careers, friends, hobbies. They're not necessarily unhappy, but something about the way relationships work today has made them step back, quietly. And if you pay attention, you'll notice something even more surprising. This pattern appears across different age groups. You see it among younger men who feel lost navigating modern dating. You see it among men in their 30s who feel invisible in a system that rewards attention in unpredictable ways. And you see it among older men who once believed relationships would naturally be part of their lives. But somewhere along the way, the emotional math stopped adding up. Because modern dating doesn't just require interest, it requires energy, attention, persistence, and sometimes the emotional return simply doesn't match the effort invested. But something about this situation still doesn't fully explain the pattern. Because historically, men have always faced rejection in dating. That's not new. Rejection has always been part of the process. So why does it feel different today? Why are more men than ever choosing to quietly walk away instead of continuing to try? To understand that, we have to look at something deeper, not just at dating itself, but how the entire environment around relationships has changed. Because the modern dating world isn't just different in small ways, it's structurally different. And once you start looking closely at how those structures work, you begin to understand why so many men are quietly walking away. And to see how this shift plays out in real life, let's look at someone we'll call Daniel, because Daniel's story is far more common than most people realize. Daniel is 38 years old. He has a stable job, a small group of close friends, a quiet apartment in a mid-sized city. A few years ago, Daniel imagined his life would look different by now. Marriage, maybe children, the kind of stable relationship that slowly becomes the center of a person's life. And for a while, that path seemed possible. Daniel was married once.
It didn't end dramatically. There was no scandal, no explosive conflict, just the slow realization that the relationship wasn't working anymore. Eventually, they separated. The divorce was difficult but not destructive. After some time, Daniel decided he was ready to try dating again. At first, he approached it with cautious optimism. Friends encouraged him to download dating apps. They told him that this was simply how people met now. So, Daniel created a profile, uploaded a few photos, wrote a short bio, and waited. At the beginning, the experience felt almost exciting. New matches appeared, conversations started. There was the familiar feeling of possibility. But slowly, something began to feel different. Many conversations would start and then suddenly disappear. Some matches never responded at all. Others would talk for a few days, sometimes even weeks, and then vanish without explanation.
At first, Daniel assumed this was just bad luck. Dating had always involved uncertainty. But after months of the same pattern repeating, he began to notice something. The effort required to maintain even a single conversation was surprisingly high. Messages needed to be clever, engaging, interesting enough to compete with dozens of other conversations happening at the same time. And even when a conversation seemed promising, there was no guarantee it would lead anywhere. Plans were often canceled. Interest faded quickly. Sometimes the energy he invested simply disappeared into silence. And over time, Daniel found himself asking a quiet question. Was the process itself still worth it? But the strange thing was, Daniel wasn't bitter. He didn't blame women. He didn't believe anyone was doing something wrong. In fact, he understood the situation from the other side as well. Dating apps present people with enormous numbers of choices. When dozens or even hundreds of potential partners are visible on a screen, attention becomes divided. Everyone becomes more selective, more cautious, more uncertain. But the emotional result for many men is something subtle. They begin to feel replaceable. Not rejected in a dramatic way, just quietly interchangeable. And that feeling slowly changes how much effort they are willing to invest. At first, Daniel simply used the apps less often. Then he stopped initiating conversations as frequently. Eventually, entire weeks passed where he didn't open the app at all. One day, without much thought, he deleted it. There was no announcement, no frustration, just a quiet decision. And something interesting happened after that. Daniel didn't feel lonely, he felt relieved. His evenings became simpler. He spent more time working out, reading, meeting friends. The constant background pressure of trying to maintain conversations with strangers disappeared. And in that silence, Daniel realized something he hadn't noticed before. For the past year, dating had begun to feel less like connection and more like performance. And once that realization settled in, the motivation to return became surprisingly weak. But Daniel's story isn't unique. In fact, versions of it are becoming increasingly common. Men who once participated actively in dating are gradually choosing distance instead, not because they stopped wanting relationships, but because the structure of modern dating sometimes makes the process itself feel exhausting. And Daniel is only one example. Because if you look at younger men navigating this environment for the first time, you start to see an entirely different layer of the story, a layer that reveals how modern dating systems are quietly reshaping expectations, behavior, and emotional investment. And to understand that part of the picture, we need to look at someone else, someone we'll call Alex. Because Alex grew up in a world where dating apps weren't an option. They were the default, and that difference changes everything. Alex is 29. He belongs to a generation that grew up with smartphones, social media, and dating apps as normal part of life. Unlike Daniel, Alex never experienced dating before these systems existed. For him, meeting people through an app was never unusual. It was simply the way things worked.
Swipe, match, start a conversation. At first, the process seems simple, almost efficient. You open the app, browse through profiles, and within minutes you're interacting with people you might never have met otherwise. In theory, it feels like opportunity. But after spending time inside these platforms, many men begin to notice something about how the system actually functions. Because dating apps don't just connect people, they organize attention. And attention in digital environments doesn't distribute evenly. Some profiles receive enormous amounts of visibility. Others remain almost invisible. It's not always about personality or even compatibility. Often, it's about a small number of signals that determine who gets attention first. Photos, timing, algorithms. And when thousands of people are competing for attention in the same digital space, the dynamics start to change. For many men like Alex, the experience begins with curiosity, but over time, it often turns into something else. A sense that the environment itself is extremely competitive. Matches happen, but conversations are unpredictable. Some messages go unanswered. Others receive replies that disappear after a few exchanges. Sometimes a conversation feels promising and then suddenly stops without explanation. At first, Alex assumed this was simply part of the process, but after months of using the apps, a pattern started to emerge. Effort did not always correlate with outcome. Writing thoughtful messages didn't necessarily improve responses. Being respectful didn't guarantee engagement, and the sheer volume of interactions happening simultaneously meant that any single conversation could easily be replaced.
In other words, the environment encouraged rapid movement from one interaction to another. And over time, this begins to shape behavior on both sides. People become more cautious, more selective, more distracted. The result is a system where genuine connection becomes harder to sustain. But something even more subtle happens beneath the surface. When interactions are filtered through a digital marketplace, the experience of dating can start to feel transactional. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but structurally. Profiles become categories. Conversations become evaluations, and attention becomes something that constantly shifts from one person to another. For some people, this environment feels exciting, but for many men, it creates a quiet sense of instability. Because when attention is constantly moving, emotional investment becomes risky. Why invest deeply in a conversation that could disappear tomorrow? Why pursue someone who may already be juggling multiple interactions? Over time, many men unconsciously adapt to this environment. Some become more detached, others become more cautious, and some, like Alex, begin to question whether the entire process feels natural at all. One evening, after another week of conversations that went nowhere, Alex closed the app and said something simple to a friend. It just feels like too much effort for something that rarely goes anywhere. There was no anger in his voice, just fatigue. And that fatigue seems to be appearing in more and more conversations among men. Because while dating apps expanded the number of possible connections, they also changed the emotional rhythm of dating itself. Interactions became faster, more numerous, but often less stable. And when connection starts to feel uncertain and temporary, the motivation to keep trying can slowly fade. But even that explanation doesn't fully capture the deeper shift taking place. Because the real change may not just be about apps, it may be about something more psychological. Something that slowly alters how men experience rejection, effort, and emotional risk. And when that shift reaches a certain point, something interesting begins to happen. Many men don't rebel against the system, they simply step away from it. And to understand why that quiet withdrawal happens, we need to look at the emotional side of this experience. Because over time, the hidden cost of modern dating isn't just rejection. It's something more subtle, emotional exhaustion.
At first, the emotional cost of modern dating is almost invisible. It doesn't arrive all at once. There's no dramatic moment where someone suddenly decides they're done. Instead, it accumulates slowly, conversation by conversation, match by match, week after week. And for many men, the first sign of that cost is subtle. A feeling that the effort required to participate in dating keeps increasing, while the emotional return keeps decreasing. It starts with small things: messages that go unanswered, plans that never materialize, conversations that feel promising for a few days and then suddenly disappear. None of these experiences are new in dating. Rejection has always been part of relationships. But what makes modern dating different is frequency. These moments happen more often, and they happen faster. A conversation can begin and end within the span of a single evening. Interest can appear and disappear before a real connection has time to develop. Over time, this rhythm begins to affect how men emotionally approach the entire process. Because when interactions repeatedly fail to stabilize into something real, the brain adapts. It begins to protect itself. Some men stop investing emotionally in early conversations. Others reduce how often they initiate interactions. And some gradually stop participating altogether. But what's important is that this withdrawal rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It doesn't look like anger. It doesn't look like protest. It looks like quiet disengagement. A man who once opened dating apps every day now opens them once a week, then once a month. Eventually, he forgets the app is even installed. And something interesting happens when that pattern spreads across thousands or millions of men. The dating environment itself begins to shift. Because dating markets rely on participation. When people slowly reduce their engagement, the system becomes more unstable. More conversations fade, more matches disappear, and the cycle continues. But beneath these patterns lies something deeper. For many men, modern dating creates a particular psychological experience that is rarely discussed openly. A subtle sense of invisibility. Not total rejection, not humiliation, just the persistent feeling of being overlooked. A message sent, but not answered. A match made, but never acknowledged. A conversation started, but never continued. Each individual moment seems insignificant, but over time, those moments accumulate. And when enough of them accumulate, the emotional message becomes difficult to ignore. Effort does not guarantee attention.
Attention does not guarantee connection, and connection does not guarantee stability. So the brain begins to ask a very practical question. Is this process worth the emotional energy it requires? For some men, the answer is still yes. But for others, the calculation begins to change, especially as life moves forward. Work becomes more demanding, responsibilities increase, time becomes more valuable, and the willingness to invest emotional energy into uncertain outcomes slowly declines. But something about this shift still surprises many observers, because the men stepping away from dating are not necessarily the ones who struggle the most in life. Many are stable, functional, even successful. They simply reach a point where the emotional cost of participating in modern dating begins to feel disproportionate to the rewards. And once that perception settles in, the behavior that follows is rarely dramatic. It's quiet, subtle, almost invisible. A man stops swiping, stops initiating conversations, stops planning dates, and instead begins focusing his energy elsewhere: career, fitness, friendships, solitude. And from the outside, his life appears perfectly normal. But inside the dating ecosystem, something important has changed. He's no longer participating. And when enough men quietly reach that same conclusion, a larger pattern begins to emerge.
a pattern that becomes visible only when you step back and observe the system as a whole. Because once you start looking closely, you realize that many men are not just reducing their effort, they're slowly exiting the environment entirely. And that quiet exit is becoming more common than most people realize. To see how this looks in practice, we need to look at someone else, someone who represents a different stage of life, someone who once believed relationships would naturally be part of his future, but eventually made a decision that many men are now making quietly. A man we'll call Mark. Mark is 42. From the outside, his life looks stable. He runs a small business that has grown steadily over the past decade. He owns a comfortable home. He travels occasionally. He has a circle of friends he's known since his 20s. If you met Mark casually, you probably wouldn't assume anything was missing from his life. But if you ask him about relationships today, his answer is surprisingly simple. I'm not really dating anymore. There was no dramatic turning point that led him to that decision, no single heartbreak, no defining moment, just a gradual realization over time. Like Daniel, Mark spent several years navigating the modern dating environment. He used apps, went on dates, met interesting people. Some connections lasted a few weeks, others lasted several months, but none of them seemed to develop into the kind of stable relationship he once imagined. At first, he assumed he simply hadn't met the right person yet. That's what most people believe when relationships don't work out. So he kept trying. But over time, something inside him slowly shifted, not in a negative way, just quietly. Mark began to notice how much emotional energy dating required: planning, messaging, initiating conversations, navigating uncertainty, and often repeating the same process with entirely new people, again and again and again. At some point, he started asking himself a simple question. What if I just stopped doing this? Not forever, just for a while. So he did. He paused the apps, focused on work, spent more time with friends, picked up hobbies he had ignored for years, and after a few months, something unexpected happened. His life didn't feel emptier, it felt calmer. There was less emotional uncertainty, less time spent wondering whether someone would respond, less mental space occupied by conversations that might lead nowhere. And gradually, Mark realized something important. For the first time in years, he felt completely at peace with his daily routine. Not lonely, just stable. But this is the part of the story that many people misunderstand. When men quietly step away from dating, it isn't always because they've given up on relationships entirely. Sometimes it's because they've discovered that their lives function well without the emotional turbulence that dating can bring. They invest their energy elsewhere: career growth, financial stability, health, friendships, personal projects. And in many cases, their lives continue moving forward in meaningful ways. But because these men aren't actively participating in dating culture anymore, their experiences often remain invisible. They're not on the apps, they're not discussing dating stories at social gatherings. They're simply living their lives outside that system.
And when enough men quietly make that same decision, something subtle begins to change in the broader landscape of relationships. The dating environment itself becomes skewed because participation is no longer evenly distributed. Some people become hypervisible, constantly interacting, constantly matching, constantly cycling through new connections, while others slowly fade out of the system entirely, not because they were pushed out, but because they quietly chose to leave. And once you begin to recognize this pattern, it becomes difficult to ignore. More and more men are not fighting the dating system, they're not trying to reform it, they're not organizing movements against it, they're simply disengaging, silently. And once you notice this shift, you begin to see it in conversations everywhere. Friends who say they're taking a break from dating,
Coworkers who haven't been in a relationship for years but seem perfectly content. Men who focus their energy on building stable, independent lives instead of chasing uncertain connections. And when you step back and observe all of these individual stories together, a larger question begins to emerge. What happens to modern relationships if more and more men quietly decide that participating in the dating system no longer feels worth the effort? And the answer to that question reveals something deeper about the emotional reality many men are experiencing today. Because the real story isn't about men leaving dating out of anger. It's about something much quieter, something much more human. And once you understand that truth, the entire situation starts to make a lot more sense. When people talk about changes in modern dating, the conversation often becomes very loud. Blame gets assigned, arguments begin, entire groups of people are accused of ruining relationships. But if you listen carefully to the stories we've just explored, something very different appears. Most of the men quietly stepping away from dating are not angry. They're not organizing protests. They're not trying to make statements. They're simply responding to how the experience feels. And for many of them, the feeling that slowly emerges over time is not resentment, it's exhaustion. Because modern dating asks for a particular kind of emotional investment. You have to stay optimistic through uncertainty. You have to keep initiating conversations. You have to continue investing attention into interactions that may disappear without explanation. For some people, this environment feels exciting, but for many men, it eventually begins to feel draining, not because connection itself has lost its value, but because the process of searching for connection has changed. And that may be the most important insight hidden inside this quiet shift. Many men are not leaving dating because they stopped wanting relationships. They're leaving because the environment surrounding relationships no longer feels meaningful to them. The incentives changed, the structure changed, the rhythm of interaction changed. And for many men, those changes slowly altered the emotional experience of dating itself. Instead of feeling like a natural path toward connection, the process can sometimes feel like a continuous performance. You must compete for attention, maintain interest, navigate an environment where conversations appear and disappear rapidly. And after enough time inside that system, some men begin to ask themselves a simple question. Is this actually how I want to spend my emotional energy? For some, the answer remains yes. They continue searching, they continue trying. But for others, the answer quietly becomes no. And when that realization appears, the response is rarely dramatic. There is no public declaration, no anger, no final confrontation, just a quiet shift in priorities. Energy moves toward other parts of life: work, friendships, personal growth, peace.
And when enough men begin making that same quiet decision, something interesting begins to happen. The dating landscape slowly changes, not because anyone forced it to change, but because participation itself begins to decline. And this raises a deeper question about the future of relationships. If more and more men quietly step away from modern dating, what does that reveal about the system itself? Is the issue simply individual frustration? Or does it suggest that the structure of modern dating may be evolving faster than people can emotionally adapt? Because throughout history, relationships have always been shaped by the environments in which people meet. And today, that environment is changing faster than ever before. Technology has expanded opportunities, but it has also transformed how attention, connection, and emotional investment function. And sometimes, when systems change rapidly, human behavior adapts in unexpected ways. The quiet exit of many men from the dating world may be one of those adaptations. Not a rebellion, not a collapse, just a shift. A quiet recalibration of where people choose to place their time, attention, and emotional energy.
And perhaps the most important question isn't why some men are leaving dating. Perhaps the deeper question is this: what would need to change for them to want to return? Because when people step away from something meaningful, it's rarely because they stopped valuing it. More often, it's because the experience itself stopped feeling worth the effort. And if that experience changes again in the future, the behavior may change as well. But for now, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. Across different ages, careers, and backgrounds, more men than ever are quietly stepping away from the modern dating world. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. And once you notice this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. If this perspective resonated with you, consider subscribing. This channel explores the realities many people feel but rarely talk about. And sometimes, understanding the patterns shaping our lives is the first step toward changing them.